Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of the Vulnerable Populations video podcast. To those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm your host, Georgia Cook. Our topic today is physically compromised populations. We have so many special guests for you who will be helping us to really understand this population today. We will consult with a few experts on vulnerable populations to discuss what the extent of the issue is and to kind of gain some background into the issue. We will also be reaching out to someone who suffers personally from being physically compromised to find out what it really means to be physically compromised and how it affects their daily life. Lastly, we will hear from a few expert community nurses today to attain some additional information on this population and their role as a nurse to specifically care for these patients. Let's start off with our first guest, who is an expert on the topic of physically compromised populations. Tori Flickinger will be defining what it truly means to be physically compromised. Hi, Tori. Could you tell us some more about this topic?
Thank you for having me, Georgia. It's great to be here. So, to be physically compromised means that someone has a condition with their mind or their body that makes it so they struggle to function normally without assistance. There are many different types of disabilities that can affect your vision, your movement, your thinking, your communication, your mental health, and even relationships with other people, and that's just to name a few. So just imagine the activities many of us do on a regular daily basis that would become very difficult if we had a disability. There are 3 different dimensions of disabilities, and the first is being an impairment, which could be from the result of a loss of a limb or your eyesight. The second is an activity limitation, and this may be from a difficulty hearing or walking. Then the last is a participation restriction, and this is with normal daily activities like working or other social and recreational activities. It's very important to remember that all disabilities are different for everyone. So for example, someone could be born with a disability like Down syndrome, or it could show up later during their childhood like autism. It could be from after an accident resulting in a traumatic brain injury, or it could be because of a long-term health condition like diabetes. Many people who are physically compromised may struggle finding jobs that accommodate their disabilities, and this can make it very difficult for them to feed their families or get the assistance they need and require to stay healthy and safe. It's very important for our communities to accommodate people with disabilities so that we can decrease or eliminate any limitations and restrictions and also promote a high quality of life for them. Thank you so much for having me on the Vulnerable Populations podcast today.
Thanks, Tori, for that information. It really gives us some insight into this vulnerable population and who it's comprised of, as well as some of the issues that they can face. Our next guest today is Sydney Brown, another expert. She specializes in the history and background of this specific population. Hi, Sydney. First of all, thank you all so much for being here and being able to join us today. Can you delve into the history of the physically compromised and possibly give us some insight into some interventions that have been done in the past to alleviate this issue?
Hi Georgia, I'm excited to be here today to talk to you all about the extensive history of the physically compromised individuals and how the issue was handled in the past. So unfortunately, the United States has a long history of vulnerability. Starting in the early 20th century, and then it continued to occur throughout the 70s and the 80s when the war on poverty was occurring. So the relationship between poverty and vulnerability of the physically compromised individuals were clearly documented in the past. So beginning in the 20th century, people suffered through many epidemics such as like typhus, cholera, yellow fever, and many others that swept through the urban slums. And then while that was occurring, the farmers still had not fully recovered from the Civil War. So they were lacking proper nutrition, which made them vulnerable to the epidemics and also to other diseases such as like hookworm or pellagra. So in 1973, stagflation occurred, which is high inflation mixed with high unemployment, which didn't do the economy any favors or the physically compromised because they already struggle finding a job in the first place. And then the poverty rate was at an all-time high during that time, which was 12 to 15%. So they tried to address the war on poverty, and unfortunately, the vulnerability of the physically compromised just wasn't able to rise over the poverty line. They just continued to struggle. So like Tori stated, many people who are compromised struggle daily to find jobs, make money, which can be difficult for them to feed their families and get the assistance they need. And this is what was occurring in the past as well. So, throughout the 20th century, there were many disability rights that were put into place to try to help the disabled population. A lot of them pertained to mental health, while others were with physically compromised and cognitively compromised. So, I'll just talk about a few here. So, in 1909, Clifford Beers founded the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which was successful and is still in place today, but it's now called Mental Health of America. And then in 1935, the League of Physically Handicapped in New York was formed to protest against the discrimination that was occurring by the Works Progress Administration. And then in 1940, the American Federation of Physically Handicapped was the first cross-disability national political organization that was really trying to stop the job discrimination of disabled individuals, and they were lobbying for all kinds of legislation to be approved and other initiatives to help these individuals. So I could go on and on about these organizations, but those are just a couple that stuck out to me. And as you guys can tell, that's a pretty long and complex version of how this issue has occurred in the past. And I enjoyed talking to you guys, so thanks for having me today, and I'll see you next time.
Wow, Sydney, that was very eye-opening. Thank you for joining us today. Next up is our expert joining us from the Center for Disease Control, Emily Caton. She's here today to shine some light on just how extensive this issue is and to share some of the data that she's been observing on this health problem. Hi, Emily. What do you and the CDC have to say about the physically compromised population?
Hey Georgia, thanks for having me here today. So the extent of this issue with physically compromised individual includes so many things. For example, working with the CDC, we have done some studies that have shown that people with these physical disabilities are more likely to report things such as poor overall health, less access to adequate health care. They're more likely to smoke and have physical inactivities, overall leading to impact on their health. There is some statistics showing that 23% of adults in Iowa do have some type of disability. So think about that. That is quite a few people in our state that deal with this issue. Adults with disabilities are also 3 times more likely to have heart disease, stroke, diabetes, or cancer rather than adults without any of these physical disabilities. With these physical disabilities, it can put a greater risk for health problems such as bowel or bladder problems, fatigue, injury, mental health and depression, overweight and obesity, pain, and pressure ulcers and sores just from that inactivity as I talked about earlier. Another thing that comes along with the issue of being physically disabled includes putting their family and individual at risk for decreased income potential. Getting adequate health care for these healthcare problems that come along with being physically compromised can be expensive, and according to different studies that at the CDC that we have been doing in Iowa, the expenditures per person from a person with a disability per year is $11,887 for just one person for those healthcare costs. So that can be quite expensive when you think about that. So these people tend to have lower incomes, and then with that have less access to healthcare due to not having the correct insurance. They might not have a job that gets them the adequate insurance to pay for these, so that can be a problem as well. Lastly, some things I just wanted to mention that people might not think about is in situations such as like an emergency disaster that may strike quickly without warning, that may lead to people having to leave or being confined in their homes unexpectedly, such as everything that's happening right now with the coronavirus, people with those disabilities can have a quite challenge trying to deal with those issues. So that's another thing to think about. And then lastly, one thing is people with physically compromised diseases and things are at a high risk of abuse, violence, and harm. And actually, in the United States, people with these disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to be victimized than people without. So those are some things that go along with physically compromised. And thank you so much for having me again today here on the podcast. I enjoyed getting to share some information with you.
Thanks for your time and all of that useful information, Emily. Next, we'll hear from Emily Sickles, who is a physically compromised citizen herself. She's here to speak to us about who this issue affects and what it's really like to be in this situation. Hey, Emily.
Thanks for having me here today, Georgia. Like you said, I myself am physically compromised. And although everyone's situation is different, I will do my best at speaking on behalf of myself along with the others who are physically compromised. Emily Caton just did a fantastic job uncovering how physically compromised individuals are more at risk for many different health issues, financial problems, among with many other things. But what a lot of people don't realize is that for those that are physically compromised, every single day is impacted by the environment that is surrounding us. For example, it can be very stressful to go out into public at times, especially if it's a new or unknown territory. When going out into public, there are a lot of things to keep in mind, like what if the environment isn't accessible to me, or if they do not have the assistive technology that I need. Things like curbs without ramps or stairs that don't have handrails are some of the little things that we need to pay attention to whenever we are in public. Along with the physical environment, there are some people who have a very negative attitude towards people like me who have a physical disability. And many of those people may have a stigma towards us or have a stereotype, such as that we have a poor quality of life, which is definitely not true. While this can all take a huge toll on the individuals that personally go through these adversities, it also affects the loved ones that surround us as well. Those that are caring for us have to carry the burden of handling the stress of all the risk and adversities we face, which can be very, very hard to see. Therefore, it is important to be mindful of those that are in the community, whether they have a disability or if they do not, and to not judge others or associate a stereotype towards anyone, because you truly do not know what is actually going on in their lives. I really hope I gave you and everyone listening enough perspective to understand what it's like to be physically compromised. Again, thanks for letting me share my story and insight onto this topic.
Next, we'll hear from two experts, McKenna Rickard and Grace Garber, about current practices and methods that have been used to address this issue of physically compromised populations. First, Grace is here to elaborate on whether or not these practices have been effective, and if the needs of physically compromised are even being met. Hi, Grace.
Hi, Georgia. Thanks for having me on the show. Some of the current practices and methods that are assisting those with physical disabilities really vary depending on what and where the specific disability is. Humans are highly adaptable to their situation, and so the severity of the handicap is really important as to what the needs are of that person. Thanks to the American Disabilities Act of 1990, public places, public transit, schools, gas stations, libraries, all things like that should have disability accommodations like wheelchair ramps, elevators, and the like. Other than the laws that our country has made to help those with physical handicaps, other than that, interdisciplinary teams like physical therapy and occupational therapy, these professions have made great progress towards helping physically compromised people. According to the National Health Institute, the most common assistive and rehabilitative devices are things like walkers, canes, prosthetics, hearing aids, and scooters. These are things that we all see pretty frequently in the healthcare field. Some things that are a little bit more diverse for more severe conditions are things like automatic page turners, voice recognition for computers, specialized adapters for daily items like hairbrushes and silverware, things like that. As a nation, we've made a lot of advancements in including this vulnerable population with all of the accommodations that are available. However, we still have a long way to go. And a question was raised, do all of these accommodations meet the needs of the population that's being served? Well, it depends on what you're looking at. According to the American Disabilities Act, public buildings should have wheelchair ramps, wider doors, braille, things like that to accommodate these people and what they need. Does this always happen? No. And older buildings are really slow to make updates because it's expensive for the owners who own the buildings to make those changes. So those needs really aren't always being met. People with disabilities have much lower employment rates, even though the ADA makes it illegal to discriminate against people with handicaps. The ADA says that areas that are slower to come around to the changes that are needed are the healthcare field, the housing field, and community support. So that's something we need to work on as a healthcare field particularly. Overall, the needs are being pretty well met for equipment, but the standards of buildings and public places are really lacking. Thanks for your ears, and thanks for having me on the show today, Georgia.
Thanks for all of that useful information concerning the needs of physically compromised populations, Grace. Now we'll hear from McKenna about the changes she recommends, as well as her personal experiences in patient care of a physically disabled client. Hey there, McKenna.
Hi, Georgia. It's great to be here today to share my insight. I have actually taken care of someone who is physically compromised, and she has shared some things with me that are relevant to this topic. So she requires certain equipment to achieve her independence or to remain safe and healthy, and some of these devices are provided through Medicaid, but she has to prove that she still needs these devices every 3 months or every few months in order to receive them. So my client is also employed, and her job does provide those resources that she needs to live her daily life independently. But like Grace said, many others don't have those resources. My client has also stated that she fears going to the ER whenever she becomes ill or has complications because they aren't used to taking care of patients who are compromised, and it can get in the way of her receiving adequate care. So it's great that we have community nurses that can reach out to the public in the healthcare field and to educate them on the physically compromised and how to interact with them and how to provide adequate personalized care to them in hospitals. So some changes that I would recommend is implementing programs that can provide training to healthcare professionals so that they can emphasize health promotion for physically compromised patients, because currently there's a lack of that in this area, and this population deserves to lead a high-functioning life. So while on the topic of having them lead high-functioning lives, it would be beneficial to them to introduce fines for specific businesses and other public places that still have not provided the proper access for this population. Also, increasing options of employment for this population is important because it can involve them more in interacting with their society and can increase the likelihood of improving their health status, because then if they have employee benefits, it makes it easier for them to address their problems sooner instead of disregarding them until it's too late. So that's all I have for you. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of the podcast today.
Our next two guests today are community nurses Megan Anderson and Riley Dickey, here to tell us about the roles of nursing in caring for the physically compromised clients, as well as potential community involvement is Megan. Hi there, Megan. Can you share your nursing experience with us?
Hi guys, thanks for all having me today. I'm really happy to be here and talk about my job as a community health nurse. So first I'm going to talk about some roles that we do in the community as nurses. Our main role as a community health nurse in the community is to be an advocate for those who are physically compromised and their access to not only healthcare, but maybe some transportation or financial services. The physically compromised pay a lot of money for the care that they receive, and it is our job to help them find resources to help them through it. Another job we do throughout the community is being a health educator. We educate the community about the needs of people who are physically compromised. And lastly, we do a lot of referring to local resources in the community such as maybe counseling, physical therapy, or maybe just even some events that are happening in the community. Us nurses look at the community as a whole and get involved to make our community a little better and safe place for everybody. We know that not everywhere is wheelchair accessible and such for those who are wheelchair bound. We want more accessible places in the community for those who are physically compromised. Like stated above, we refer people to transportation companies a lot, and we want to make easy ways for safe transportations to doctor's appointments or the grocery store and such things like that. We have a great community that has many options for those who are compromised, such as wheelchair basketball tournaments and Special Olympics in the area as well. We really try to make our community fun, safe, and accessible for everybody.
For our last guest speaker today, we have Riley, who is also a community nurse. She's going to be sharing how this population affects the community that we live in personally. Hi, Riley. Could you tell us some more about that, please?
Thanks for the introduction. I will be talking about how the physically compromised affects the community we live in. So obviously in a bigger community like Waterloo, there's going to be more of a need for the physically compromised people because it's more prevalent. This community has already been incorporating campgrounds and parks in Waterloo, like the Big Woods Lake Campground, and there's other recreational areas as well that are handicap accessible. Many places in public like stores, parks, parking lots, restaurants, and more have also become handicap accessible. Cedar Falls and Waterloo host events also such as the Polar Plunge that benefit Special Olympics Iowa. So by hosting these events, they are supporting this population of the physically compromised and their recreational activities that many of them enjoy to participate in. The University of Northern Iowa actually holds the Special Olympics in their field house yearly that celebrates those who are physically compromised and recognizes their accomplishments. Many of these people look forward to this event each and every year. And also the ARC Cedar Valley is another organization that is super helpful because it offers education on education employment, financial services, home health services, transportation to health services and elsewhere, and even recreational services. So this website just makes it aware of the services located in the Cedar Valley by giving their information on who to contact for these certain issues that I just listed that may arise. There are contact numbers for the main problems that the physically compromised and their families come across. So as you can see, we are making more and more strides to making resources available for all the needs this population may come across and all the needs that they may have. Thanks for having me on the podcast today.
Thank you to all of our special guests who have given us some insight into the world of the physically compromised today, as well as opened our eyes to show how community nursing can play a part. We've discussed what it means to be physically compromised, as well as the extensive history of this vulnerable population. We have consulted with experts regarding the extent of the issue and even spoken to a physically compromised citizen about who the issue affects. We have heard about methods that are currently in place to help relieve the issue. We have evaluated whether these methods have been useful and have heard firsthand about caring for someone who has a part in this population. We have heard from community nurses who have spoken about their specific role with this population, as well as delved into how our community is affected by the physically compromised. Before I head out, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to our Vulnerable Populations video podcast, and I hope you all learned quite a bit about the physically compromised population. I'm your host, Georgia Cook, and I'll see you next time.